Hello everybody, it's Sunday and Tiffany and I have been noticing a fair amount of confusion about the analysis of the TPAC article, and we think that part of this is due to the fact that you haven't had the time yet with Ollie to really understand the survey, and that not understanding the survey is causing some issues. Also the fact that we gave you two different articles to read and want to make clear that those two articles have two very different purposes. So depending on how you're thinking about those two articles, they could confuse you. The article by Ollie and Jen Shettle was about taking an instrument and using it as a measure to prove something else about their instruction. In other words, they were using the TPAC survey as a measure of how good their instruction was. So they were using it kind of as an outcome variable. Whereas, and I'm sorry I forgot the name of the authors that wrote the other article, that article is really about trying to validate the survey itself. Not to use the survey to prove something, but to prove that the survey was a good survey. And because we're doing validity and reliability this week, that's why we use that article. So the analysis here really is about, is the survey a good survey, right? And want to point you to some of Joe's files, because I think his files make this really clear what's going on here, or how to look at this. First of all, as you can see here, Joe did a different output file for each of the Cronbach alpha analysis. And each of these files, if you were to open them up, shows just the items that go with the average scale score for those items. So for example, this is looking at the PCK, and PCK has 4 items, and so there's his 4 items. Here's his Cronbach alpha for those 4 items, 0.806, and it shows the number of items. And he did that over and over for each set of items that goes with the average. Right? Let's just try to remember that this is 0.806 here. A nice thing that Joe did was he also then created an Excel file where he put just the values from each of those separate files into one single file. So if we look at PCK, right there's the 0.806, and I think if you were to open up each of Joe's files, you would see where these numbers came from, and this is close to what you see in the article you're reading. All right, but the even more complicated part of this was doing the correlation matrix between all those scales, right? So this is just a correlation of the main average scale items, either for the pre or the post, right? So several of you have an SPSS chart that looks like this, and the unfortunate thing about this kind of chart from SPSS is it gives you a lot of extra information you don't need. And the authors of the article pared this down into something much simpler. So Joe also did a nice thing where you don't need the significance value. We're going to talk about that later in the semester as regards to correlation. And you don't need the n either in reading this table. You could just put n equals 136 somewhere else, like in the footnote or something to this table, because it's the same number over and over. And it just makes it very complicated. So what Joe did, which was really nice, is he made this Excel chart. Let me increase the zoom on this a bit. Where it's really the same. I think he copied and pasted from SPSS, but you can see he cleared these 2 rows of unnecessary data. Right? Now what I'm going to do in a second is show you a correlation chart that I made based on Joe's. I copied his, and then I deleted these rows, and I also deleted the duplicate information. I'm not sure if you've seen this clearly, but in a correlation chart, you're always going to have a diagonal of 1s where you're doing the correlation of an item with itself. So the correlation of the pre-average of TK 1 through 6 is of course 100% with the same item. And then 1.159, 0.159, because it's the same 2 items being correlated, but just in a different order. So correlation tables generally don't duplicate those items, but they take the diagonal, they delete it, and they delete all the items either below or above. Right? So that's what I did with this table. So this looks a lot closer to what you see in the article, not completely the same, but it's getting to look like it. The only other thing I did besides deleting these extra values and deleting the extra rows is I also deleted the first column, because otherwise I'd have kind of a blank space. So in other words, this is like the first item, second item, third item, but here's the second, third, fourth, etc. All right, now when you get it pared down to something like this, it's a little bit easier to try to understand what's going on here. Now with the Cronbach alpha, we wanted a certain high percentage number or a high decimal number to show that there was good internal consistency between the items within that scale. But when we look at the correlation between items, between different scales, it's not necessarily clear whether we want a strong or a weak correlation. What you're looking at is, theoretically, should there be a strong or weak correlation? So for example, and there's no right or wrong answer to this, it's something I think you'd have to think about. So for example, should there be a predictable correlation between content math knowledge here? Let's go content math knowledge, looking across like this. Content math knowledge and these other skills and knowledge types. So, for example, would you expect there to be, based on the theory, a strong correlation between content math knowledge and content, I don't know if that's social studies or what. I think that's social studies knowledge. I would say no. And notice it's a 0.067. So that is kind of an indicator that these two scale items are operating as we would expect. Now, there might be certain items here that I would expect a stronger correlation. So for example, TPKA, the ultimate one is I forget what, technological pedagogical knowledge. I would expect that to have a strong relationship with technology knowledge and also with pedagogical knowledge. Because I don't think you can have technological pedagogical knowledge unless you have both those two things, right? And so what I would be looking for here is, might be easier for to see here. Is there a strong correlation between this and pedagogical knowledge, 0.55, or between this and, what's the other thing I said? Pedagogical knowledge. Is that this one? 0.569. You really need to have the survey open and looking at these together. But here, it seems to me, are some correlations that I would expect to be strong and some other correlations that I would expect to be weak. And the more that you're seeing that, the more you're gaining confidence that this survey and the scales in the survey actually make sense for the underlying theory. Again, there's no percentage that no decimal we would exactly expect or not expect, but the question is this survey making sense in relation to the theory that it's being used to measure? All right. Hope that helps a little bit. See you guys online.